Daniel Thorne squinted against the dying sun as he approached the property line of what was now his farm. The red dust, kicked up by his horse's hooves, painted the air around him, settling on his clothes and skin like a second layer. 6 years of war had taught him to read landscapes, to sense danger before it showed itself. Something wasn't right. The farm spread before him, a weathered house, a barn with a partially collapsed roof, fields that hadn't seen crops in seasons, but it was his. Every penny he'd saved during and after the war had gone into this purchase. A place where no one would ask about the nightmares, where no one would see his hands tremble at sudden sounds. A place to forget. As he rode closer, a shape caught his eye. Something dangling from the large oak tree that stood like a sentinel near the house. At first, he thought it might be abandoned farm equipment, but the shape was too large, too distinct. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, spurring his horse forward. She hung from a thick branch, suspended by a rope that cut cruelly into her neck. Her feet, still a good 2 feet off the ground, despite her unusual height, kicked weakly. She was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and strong limbs, but it was her face that stopped Daniel's breath, pain-filled eyes, wide with the desperate desire to live, locked onto his. Her lips moved soundlessly, pleading. Daniel sat frozen in his saddle. This wasn't his fight. He'd come here to escape trouble, not find more of it. The war had taught him that sometimes survival meant turning away. Whoever she was, whatever she was, getting involved would only bring danger. The wind howled across the prairie, stirring the red dust at his horse's feet. The woman's movements were growing weaker. Her eyes never left his face. "Damn it all," Daniel muttered. Drawing his knife and dismounting in one fluid motion, he approached cautiously, unsure if this was some kind of trap. Up close. She was even more imposing. Her hands alone could probably crush his skull, but the rope cutting into her flesh, the bruises on her face, and the tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks told a different story. Daniel climbed onto a nearby crate, reached up, and sawed through the rope with 3 sharp strokes. The giant woman crashed to the ground with a thud that sent dust billowing upward. For a moment, she lay motionless, and Daniel feared he'd been too late. Then a ragged, desperate gasp tore from her throat as her body remembered how to breathe. Daniel knelt beside her, offering his canteen. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin and neck, mixing with blood where the rope had cut deep. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe." Her eyes, a startling blue against her dust-covered face, regarded him with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. She tried to speak, but managed only a hoarse whisper. Daniel leaned closer to hear. "He sold me, abandoned me." Her words faded as consciousness slipped away from her. Daniel sat back on his heels, processing her words. The farm seller, the man who'd smiled and shaken his hand just 3 days ago in town, promising a fair deal on good land. He'd never mentioned a woman, giant or otherwise, living on the property. Looking around, Daniel noticed signs of recent departure, fresh wagon tracks, a still warm cooking fire behind the house. Everything abandoned in haste. Anger rose in him, hot and unfamiliar after years of emotional numbness. He'd been deceived, drawn into something ugly with a sigh. Daniel gathered the unconscious woman in his arms, or tried to. Her size made it impossible. Instead, he fashioned a makeshift stretcher from the fallen barn door and managed to drag her into the house, leaving a deep furrow in the red dust. The interior of the house told another story, while the outside appeared abandoned. Inside was meticulously clean, with handmade furniture sized for someone of extraordinary height. This was her home, not just a place she worked. And someone had tried to hang her on what was now his property. Daniel had just finished bandaging her neck when he heard it, hoofbeats approaching in the darkness. He extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, hand resting on his pistol. 3 riders approached, their forms black silhouettes against the night sky. Daniel recognized the leader, a man named Harlow who ran the general store in town and, if rumors were true, handled loans for folks the bank wouldn't touch. "I know you're in there, Thorne," Harlow called out. "And that monster, too. Open up. We need to talk." Daniel's jaw tightened. 6 years of war had taught him to recognize threats, to measure men's intentions by the way they sat their horses, by the placement of their hands. These men hadn't come to talk. "Nothing to discuss," Daniel called back. "This is my property now, legal and proper." Harlow's laugh held no humor. "You bought the land, sure enough, but you didn't buy the debt that comes with it. The previous owner, Jenkins, he owes me, and since he ran off, I'm collecting what's owed another way." Behind him, Daniel heard movement. The giant woman had regained consciousness and was trying to stand, panic evident in her labored breathing. "Stay down," he whispered. "I'll handle this." "That freak in there," Harlow continued. "She's worth something. Circus in St. Louis would pay good money. Jenkins promised her to me when he couldn't pay his debts." Daniel's blood ran cold. "She's not property to be traded. She ain't natural. Thorne, look at the size of her. She ain't like you and me." "She's under my protection now," Daniel said, each word measured and clear. "This is my land, my house." Harlow spat. "You've got 7 days, Thorne. Either pay Jenkins' debt, $500, or leave the monster for us to handle. Your choice." The men turned their horses and rode back into the darkness, dust settling in their wake. Daniel closed the door and turned to find the woman standing, her height forcing her to stoop slightly under the ceiling beams. In the dim light, he could see the fresh bruises on her face and the angry red line where the rope had bitten into her neck. "You should have let them take me," she said, her voice a rasp. "Now they'll come for you, too." Daniel shook his head. "I've survived worse than men like that." "You don't understand what you've done," she whispered, blue eyes swimming with tears. "You can't protect me forever. 7 days is a start," Daniel replied. "First, let's get you something to eat. Then you can tell me exactly what kind of mess I've bought myself into." 3 days later, sitting by firelight, the woman, who called herself Eliza, told her story. Her unusual size had made her an outcast from childhood. When Jenkins offered her work and shelter 4 years ago, it had seemed a blessing. She built this farm with her hands, turned barren land into something that could yield life. "Jenkins wasn't cruel, at first," she explained, staring into the flames. "He was afraid of me, but he needed my strength. Then the drinking started, and the gambling." Daniel listened silently as she described how Jenkins began borrowing money, first small amounts, then more and more. "When Harlow came to collect, Jenkins offered me his payment. Said a giant like me must be worth something." Her voice didn't break, but her hands, large enough to easily crush the mug they held, trembled slightly. "The night you arrived, they'd been drinking. Decided hanging me would be entertaining before taking me to town. Jenkins left me swinging while he packed his things." Daniel pushed the debt ledger he'd found hidden in the floorboards across the table. Inside were pages of numbers, amounts borrowed and owed, with interest compounded weekly. The total, $500, was more money than most men would see in years. "This debt isn't yours," Daniel said quietly, "but the way I see it, when I bought this land, I bought everything that came with it, the good and the bad." Eliza looked up, confusion clear on her face. "Why would you take on another man's burden?" Daniel considered the question. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. Perhaps it was the soldier in him, unable to leave someone behind. Perhaps it was simply that for the first time since the war ended, he felt something other than the hollow emptiness that had followed him home. "This isn't just a burden," he said finally. "It's a partnership. Jenkins built his debt on your labor. Seems to me we can use that same strength to pay it off. Together." Suspicion flashed across Eliza's features. "What do you want from me?" "Work," Daniel answered honestly. "This farm needs rebuilding. The fields need planting. 2 people can do twice as much as 1. He paused. "And when the debt is paid, you'll be free to go or stay, as you choose." Dawn found them already at work. Daniel's military experience had taught him strategy, how to allocate resources, how to plan for efficiency. Eliza knew the land, understood its rhythms, knew which fields would yield first and which needed the most attention. They worked in silence at first, each careful to maintain distance, but as days passed, the silence grew comfortable. Daniel stopped flinching when Eliza moved suddenly. Eliza stopped hunching to appear smaller. On the 4th day, Daniel watched in amazement as Eliza lifted a fallen support beam that would have required 3 men to move. She caught his stare and tensed, waiting for fear or disgust. "That's damn useful," he said instead, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Could have used you in my regiment." A smile transformed her face, and Daniel realized it was the first time he'd seen it. Something shifted between them, subtle but undeniable. They repaired the barn roof together. Daniel, designing a pulley system that allowed Eliza to lift the heaviest beams while he secured them. They dug irrigation ditches, Eliza's strength allowing them to cover in 1 day what would have taken Daniel a week alone. They mended fences, cleared fields, and planted corn that wouldn't yield in time to pay the debt, but represented hope for the future. On the 5th day, they rode to the border market together, drawing stares and whispers. Daniel negotiated with grain merchants, securing seed on credit, and selling the few items of value Jenkins had left behind. Eliza stood tall beside him, ignoring the pointed fingers and hushed comments. As they were leaving, Harlow appeared, flanked by the same men who had visited the farm. "Thinking of running, Thorne?" he asked, his gaze flicking dismissively over Eliza. "Just preparing for the next harvest," Daniel replied evenly. "Won't be your harvest if you can't pay the debt," Harlow said. 2 more days. That night, as they ate a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Daniel outlined his plan. "We won't have enough," Eliza said after reviewing their meager savings. "Not in 2 days. Then we negotiate," Daniel replied. "Offer partial payment, ask for more time." "And if they refuse?" Daniel met her gaze steadily. "Then we fight." The question hung unspoken between them. Was she worth fighting for? Worth possibly dying for? A woman he'd known less than a week, a woman whose very existence defied explanation. "I was a soldier," Daniel said finally, answering the unasked question. "I've seen too many left behind. I won't be that man again." Eliza nodded, understanding more than he'd said. And I won't be property again, not Harlow's, not anyone's. On the morning of the 7th day, they saw the dust from afar, a dozen riders approaching, more than twice the number from before. Daniel checked his rifle and pistol. He'd spent years trying to forget the war, trying to escape violence. Now he was preparing for battle again, on land he'd bought for peace. "You don't have to stay," Eliza said, standing beside him on the porch. "This is my fight." Daniel shook his head. "Our fight, our farm." The simple words hung in the air between them. Weighted with meaning, neither was ready to examine. Eliza simply nodded and moved to take position behind the barn, as they'd planned. Harlow and his men approached slowly, confidence in every line of their bodies. Daniel noticed the coils of rope slung over their shoulders, the same type that had left scars on Eliza's neck. "Time's up, Thorne," Harlow called out, stopping his horse a safe distance away. "The land and that monster belong to us now." "I have a counter-offer," Daniel replied. "I'll pay half now, half in 3 months after harvest." Harlow laughed. "This ain't a negotiation. Jenkins signed papers. The debt is due today." "Jenkins isn't here. I am." Daniel's voice hardened. "And I say we're paying half now, half later." Harlow's smile vanished. "Take him," he ordered his men, "and find the freak." What followed was chaos, gunfire, dust clouds, the screams of men and the panicked whinnying of horses. Daniel fired methodically, aiming to wound rather than kill. He'd seen enough death in the war to last several lifetimes. From behind the barn came shouts of surprise and pain. Eliza emerged, dragging 2 men by their collars, their feet leaving furrows in the dust. She tossed them aside like rag dolls and moved to Daniel's side, presenting a united front against the remaining attackers. 3 of Harlow's men lay injured but alive. 4 more had fled. Harlow himself remained, pistol trained on Daniel. "This ain't over," he snarled. "It can be," Daniel replied. "Take your wounded and go. We'll bring payment to town next month." Harlow's finger tightened on the trigger. Before he could fire, Eliza moved with surprising speed for someone her size. In an instant, she had Harlow lifted by his throat, his feet dangling as helplessly as hers had from the tree. "Do it," one of the injured men urged. "Break his neck. Lord knows he deserves it." Daniel saw the rage in Eliza's eyes, the fury born of years of humiliation and pain. Harlow's face was turning purple, his eyes bulging with fear. "Don't," Daniel called out. "If we kill him, we're no better than they are." For a moment, he thought she wouldn't listen. Then, slowly, Eliza lowered Harlow to the ground. The man collapsed, gasping for air. "If you come back," Eliza said, her voice low and dangerous, "this land will be your grave." Daniel stepped forward, placing a small pouch of coins beside Harlow. "First payment, we'll bring the rest to town, as agreed." Harlow glared up at them, hatred and fear warring in his expression. But he took the money. As they watched their attackers retreat, Daniel felt Eliza's hand brush against his, tentative, questioning. He took it, her large fingers enveloping his completely, and something settled between them. Not romance, not yet, but understanding, partnership. 3 months transformed the farm in ways Daniel could scarcely believe. Fields that had been dust now stood tall with corn. The repaired barn housed not just his horse, but 2 milk cows purchased with careful savings. The irrigation ditches flowed with life-giving water, turning barren earth into fertile soil. But the transformation went beyond the physical land. Daniel noticed it in himself first. The nightmares that had plagued him since the war came less frequently. His hands no longer reached for his pistol at every unexpected sound. He found himself smiling sometimes, for no reason other than the simple pleasure of work well done. In Eliza, the change was even more profound. She stood straighter now, no longer trying to minimize her size. When they visited town to make payments on the debt, the ledger gradually filling with crossed-out sums, she met the stares of townspeople with dignity rather than shame. The first time Daniel heard her laugh, a pure, childlike sound erupting after he'd fallen face first into a muddy irrigation ditch, it struck him that no one who heard that sound could possibly call her a monster. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Daniel found himself speaking about the war for the first time since returning. Not the sanitized version he'd offered on the rare occasions someone asked, but the true horror of it, the friends lost, the nightmares that followed, the emptiness that had driven him to seek isolation on this remote farm. Eliza listened without judgment, her silence offering more comfort than any words could have. "I thought buying this place would give me peace," he concluded. "Instead, I bought a war." Eliza considered this. "Maybe peace isn't found in hiding from battles," she said slowly. "Maybe it's in choosing which ones are worth fighting." Daniel nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words. "3 months ago, I thought I had bought a trap," he said. "Turns out I found a home." The word hung between them, weighted with meaning. Home, not just a place, but a feeling, security, belonging. The next morning, as dawn broke over the prairie in streaks of gold and pink, Daniel stood outside, watching smoke curl from the chimney where Eliza was already preparing breakfast. In the fresh light, the farm looked different, no longer the desperate gamble of a broken man, but a place with purpose, with future. Eliza joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She'd made them herself, crafting mugs large enough for her hands from local clay. Her neck still bore the scars from the hanging, but they were fading, pink rather than angry red. "The debt collector's coming today," she said, handing him a cup. "Final payment." Daniel nodded. They had worked themselves to exhaustion for this day, selling every bit of surplus, taking odd jobs in town when they could. The pouch of coins in his pocket represented the last of their obligation. "What happens after?" Eliza asked, the question she'd been avoiding for weeks. Daniel looked up at her. This woman who had been called monster, who had been treated as property, who had shown him more about strength and dignity than anyone he'd known. "That depends," he said carefully. "You're free to go, as I promised, or... Her blue eyes held a guarded hope. "Or we keep building," Daniel said simply. "The farm, a life, together." Eliza's smile broke slowly across her face, like the dawn spreading over the prairie. "I'd like that." Later, as they rode into town to make their final payment, Daniel thought about the journey that had brought them here. 3 months ago, he'd cut down a woman from a hanging tree, expecting nothing but trouble in return. Instead, he'd found purpose, partnership, and the beginnings of something that felt remarkably like happiness. They had turned a noose into a bond. The red dust of the prairie swirled around them as they rode. 2 figures against the vast landscape, one unusually large, one average. both finally at home. The land remained harsh, the future uncertain. But now, neither of them faced it alone. Behind them, smoke curled from the chimney of their house, a signal to anyone who might see it. This is not just land claimed. This is a home defended. This is a place where even those the world calls monsters can find acceptance. This is where solitude ends and life begins again.